The strategic viability of
Beyond
Pacifica
mere lines on
toward
a map, a
constitutionally
nation is
coherent
born
Pacific
of the
nation.
land. A shared
Introduction.
contract
The question of where
rooted in
Pacifica
freedom.
should exist. The question of Pacifica's territorial extent is more consequential than it initially appears. A nation is not merely an area enclosed by a line on a map. Territory determines the strategic depth of a state, its agricultural capacity, energy independence, access to minerals and water, transportation networks, population distribution, defensibility, maritime jurisdiction, economic specialization, political cohesion, and ultimately the kind of constitutional order that can realistically operate within it. The Pacifica proposed in the constitutional and independence documents supplied for this analysis is unusually ambitious. It is not conceived merely as another conventional republic. It is expressly founded upon individual sovereignty, natural rights, constitutional limitation, federalism, political pluralism, social democracy, distributist economics, municipalism, bioregional autonomy, transparency, open source governance, and a conception of government as a fiduciary instrument of the people. The Constitution describes itself as a renewable and revocable social contract and declares that governmental authority originates in the people rather than in the state itself. The Declaration similarly frames Pacifica as a project of political independence intended to create a new constitutional government rather than merely replace one ruling class with another. That philosophy has an important geographical implication. Pacifica should be large enough to be economically and strategically self-sustaining, but not so large that its federal government becomes incapable of respecting the extreme decentralization and sovereignty of its constituent peoples. The proposed core, Alaska, Yukon, British Columbia, Washington, western Montana, Oregon, western Idaho, California, Baja California, and Hawaii, passes the first test remarkably well. Adding Nevada improves some strategic and economic characteristics, but it also introduces a genuine constitutional geographic problem. Nevada is more naturally connected to the interior West than to a strictly Pacific coastal federation. My best determination is therefore not simply, exclude Nevada, or include Nevada. The strongest version of Pacifica would establish a Pacific Continental Federation whose territorial principle is the Pacific watershed, coastal economic system, and Western continental strategic space, rather than an arbitrary east-west political boundary. Under that principle, Nevada can be included, but only if the Federation deliberately recognizes the Great Basin as a distinct constituent region rather than pretending it is culturally or ecologically identical to the Pacific coast. The result would be a Pacifica of approximately 66 million people before Nevada, roughly 69 million with Nevada, depending upon the precise boundaries chosen and the population estimates used. The U.S. Census Bureau's 2025 estimates alone put California at 39.36 million, Washington at 8.00 million, Oregon at 4.27 million, Idaho at 2.03 million, Montana at 1.14 million, Hawaii at 1.43 million, Alaska at 737,000, and Nevada at 3.28 million. Yukon adds only about 48,000 people, while British Columbia and Baja California add several million more. This is not a micronation in the conventional sense. It would be a substantial industrial civilization. The original Pacifica, a surprisingly complete geographic system. The greatest strength of the original proposal is that its territory is not merely a collection of attractive regions. It possesses an extraordinary combination of geographic complementarity. California supplies enormous population, advanced industry, agriculture, technology, finance, ports, entertainment, aerospace, biotechnology, and higher education. Washington contributes aerospace, software, cloud computing, advanced manufacturing, agriculture, hydroelectricity, maritime industry, and access to Puget Sound. Oregon adds forestry, agriculture, advanced manufacturing, technology, fisheries, and a strategically important central position on the coast. British Columbia provides the northern maritime continuation of this system. Its ports, forests, minerals, hydroelectric potential, fisheries, and Pacific-facing economy make it an exceptionally natural component of a larger Pacific economic system. Alaska then changes the strategic character of the Federation entirely. Without Alaska, Pacifica would be a powerful Pacific coastal country. With Alaska, it becomes a northern Pacific and Arctic power. Alaska gives Pacifica enormous strategic depth, Arctic frontage, mineral resources, fisheries, energy resources, access toward the Bering Strait, and proximity to both Russia and the northern Pacific approaches. Hawaii performs the opposite function. It projects Pacifica thousands of miles into the central Pacific and provides a geographic bridge between the North American Pacific coast and the broader Pacific Ocean. The result is a state with three strategic axes: the continental Pacific coast, the Arctic Northern Pacific axis, and the Central Pacific axis. That is extraordinarily valuable. The military geography of the present United States demonstrates the importance of precisely this arrangement. Alaska, Washington, California, and Hawaii are already treated as strategically significant Pacific defense locations, with major military infrastructure concentrated across those states. Congressional Research Service material describes major Army installations in Alaska and Hawaii, while major Navy installations are concentrated in Washington, California, and Hawaii. Hawaii alone had approximately 45,500 active duty U.S. personnel assigned there as of September 2025, reflecting its extraordinary strategic importance to Indo-Pacific operations. Pacifica would therefore inherit an exceptionally strong geographic foundation for a maritime defense doctrine. 2. The Pacifica problem: it is too large for centralization and perfectly sized for federalism. The principal danger of the proposed territory is not economic weakness. It is political overcentralization. Pacifica would stretch from the Arctic Ocean to Mexico and from the Pacific coast deep into the Rocky Mountains, while simultaneously incorporating Hawaii. Distances would be enormous. Climate zones would range from Arctic tundra to subtropical desert and tropical island ecosystems. Economic systems would range from resource extraction to semiconductor manufacturing, agriculture, tourism, shipping, aerospace, software, fisheries, biotechnology, energy, and entertainment. A conventional centralized republic would have difficulty governing such a country intelligently. Pacifica's constitution, however, already contains the conceptual answer. The document explicitly favors constitutionally restrained social democratic republicanism, progressive libertarianism, municipalism, bioregional autonomy, pluralism, individualism, political competition, open source governance, transparency, and evidence-based government. It also recognizes that local agreements should preferably be bioregional and envisions governance as a continuously adaptive system rather than a single rigid administrative hierarchy. This means Pacifica should not be constructed as a unitary nation-state with a powerful capital ruling distant provinces. It should instead be constructed as a federation of constitutional regions, states, indigenous sovereign nations, municipalities, and bioregional governments operating beneath a strong constitutional floor of individual rights. That distinction is crucial. The size of Pacifica becomes an advantage when governmental functions are allocated according to subsidiarity. Decisions should be made at the lowest level capable of making them competently, while genuinely continental functions, defense, currency, interstate commerce, major infrastructure, international relations, maritime policy, constitutional rights, and certain strategic resources, remain federal. The Constitution already moves in this direction by recognizing indigenous nations as possessing inherent sovereignty rather than sovereignty granted by Pacifica. It specifically states that such sovereignty is not derived from Pacifica and that indigenous nations may retain their own external relations and confederacies. This is one of the most strategically important features of the proposed constitutional model. A Pacifica that attempted to erase indigenous political sovereignty would inherit enormous legitimacy problems. A Pacifica that constitutionally accommodates indigenous nations as partners in a larger federation could instead develop a novel multinational constitutional system. 3. California, the indispensable anchor. If Pacifica's territory were designed as an economic system, California would be almost impossible to exclude. California alone provides approximately 39.4 million people under the 2025 census estimate. Its economy is sufficiently large and diversified that Pacifica without California would lose much of the economic scale necessary to support sophisticated national institutions. California supplies technology, finance, aerospace, agriculture, entertainment, military-industrial capacity, ports, higher education, scientific research, pharmaceuticals, tourism, and enormous consumer markets. Its agricultural importance is equally significant. California operated approximately 23.6 million acres of farmland in the 2025 agricultural overview, with enormous livestock and crop production. Its milk production alone was valued at more than $8.3 billion in the data reported by USDA. The constitutional question is therefore not whether California belongs in Pacifica. It is whether Pacifica can prevent California from becoming Pacifica. This is precisely where the proposed federal structure matters. California would possess enormous population and economic weight. If representation were purely proportional, California could dominate the lower chamber. If representation were purely equal by state, California would be dramatically underrepresented. A sophisticated Pacifican constitution therefore requires a bicameral legislature in which one chamber represents population and the other represents states or constituent jurisdictions, combined with a constitutional rights regime that neither chamber can casually override. The Constitution's emphasis on individual sovereignty is especially important here. The people must remain the ultimate constitutional unit rather than merely being absorbed into the political identity of the largest state. IV. The Pacific Northwest, the constitutional heartland. Washington, Oregon, British Columbia, and the western portions of Idaho and Montana form another natural component of Pacifica. Washington alone had approximately 8 million residents in 2025, having grown 3.8% from its 2020 estimated base. Its economy is technologically advanced and highly integrated with Pacific maritime commerce. Oregon provides a complementary combination of agriculture, forestry, manufacturing, technology, fisheries, and renewable energy. Its 2025 agricultural data covered approximately 15.3 million acres of farm operations. Washington had approximately 13.7 million agricultural acres. The Columbia River system is particularly important. A Pacifica containing Washington, Oregon, British Columbia, and western Idaho would control an enormous interconnected river and electricity system. The Columbia Basin would become a national strategic asset rather than a collection of jurisdictions negotiating endlessly over an international boundary. That could produce enormous gains in electricity, irrigation, navigation, agriculture, fisheries management, flood control, and environmental restoration. But it also creates a constitutional warning. Water should not become simply another instrument of federal power. The Constitution's bioregional principles suggest a better arrangement: watershed authorities governed jointly by the affected states, municipalities, indigenous nations, and federal government, with constitutional requirements for transparency, scientific review, compensation, and ecological protection. Such institutions would be far more consistent with Pacifica's philosophy than simply creating a gigantic federal water bureaucracy. V. Alaska and Yukon, the northern strategic frontier. Alaska is disproportionately important relative to its population. Its 2025 population was approximately 737,000, but population is a poor measure of its strategic value. Alaska provides enormous territory, Arctic coastline, fisheries, minerals, energy, military depth, and access to the Bering region. Yukon is different. Its population is only about 48,000, according to current Yukon statistics, but it provides geographic continuity between Alaska and British Columbia. Yukon reported a population of 48,135 in December 2025. This illustrates a central principle of territorial design. Small populations can possess enormous strategic value. Yukon would make Pacifica geographically coherent across the northern continental corridor. Without Yukon, Alaska and British Columbia would be separated by Canadian territory, creating a geopolitical discontinuity directly through the middle of Pacifica's northern flank. With Yukon, the Northern Territory becomes contiguous. Yet Yukon should not simply be treated as another ordinary state. Its population, geography, indigenous political structures, and infrastructure justify a constitutionally protected territorial status with substantial autonomy. Alaska should likewise possess extraordinary regional autonomy. The Arctic should not be administered as though it were Sacramento or Los Angeles. VI. Baja California, the southern strategic anchor. Baja California is strategically valuable for a different reason. It extends Pacifica's coastline southward, brings the Federation closer to the Gulf of California, gives it additional fisheries and agricultural regions, strengthens the Pacific maritime system, and creates continuity between California and the Mexican Pacific. It also transforms Pacifica into a genuine North American Pacific state rather than an exclusively Northern Anglo-American political construction. But Baja California introduces perhaps the greatest diplomatic challenge in the entire proposal. Unlike Alaska, Washington, Oregon, California, or Nevada, Baja California is not presently within the United States or Canada. It is Mexican territory. Its incorporation into Pacifica therefore cannot plausibly be treated as analogous to rearranging U.S. state boundaries. A viable Pacifica would have to make Baja California's participation dependent upon the freely expressed democratic consent of its population and a negotiated settlement with Mexico. The same principle should apply to every other external territory. The Declaration of Independence's philosophy of self-determination is compatible with this, but only if self-determination is applied consistently. Pacifica cannot credibly proclaim individual sovereignty while treating millions of people as territory to be acquired without their consent. Therefore, Baja California should be understood as a conditional accession possibility, not an assumed territorial possession. 7. Hawaii, essential strategically, different constitutionally. Hawaii is geographically disconnected from continental Pacifica, but strategically it belongs. Indeed, Hawaii makes Pacifica more strategically coherent rather than less. It occupies a central position in the North Pacific and has enormous significance for maritime communications, naval operations, air transport, undersea cables, satellite infrastructure, fisheries, and Pacific diplomacy. Its inclusion also transforms Pacifica from a continental power with an island possession into a genuinely Pacific nation. But Hawaii should have exceptional constitutional protections. The history, culture, land system, environmental circumstances, and indigenous sovereignty questions of Hawaii are sufficiently distinct that simply treating it as another state would be constitutionally crude. The Pacifica Constitution already provides a conceptual mechanism through its recognition of indigenous sovereignty. A mature Pacifican constitutional settlement should therefore create a Pacific Islands constitutional compact within the Federation, giving Hawaii extensive authority over land, culture, environment, water, development, and local governance. This is not a weakness. It is precisely how a large federation preserves legitimacy. 8. The Nevada question. Nevada is the most interesting case. Adding Nevada increases population by roughly 3.3 million and adds Las Vegas, Reno, substantial solar potential, mineral resources, transportation corridors, and strategic depth east of the Sierra Nevada. It also creates a more defensible continental interior. From the perspective of economic geography, Nevada is closely tied to California. Reno is deeply integrated with the California economic system, while Las Vegas functions as a major Western metropolitan and tourism center. From the perspective of environmental geography, however, Nevada is overwhelmingly Great Basin rather than Pacific Coast. From the perspective of political geography, Nevada is a bridge between the Pacific and interior West. Consequently, Nevada is neither obviously inside nor obviously outside Pacifica. My conclusion is that Nevada should be eligible for inclusion but should not be required for Pacifica's viability. The distinction is important. Pacifica is economically viable without Nevada. Pacifica is strategically viable without Nevada. Pacifica is geographically coherent without Nevada. But Nevada makes Pacifica more territorially robust. It provides additional interior depth, minerals, energy, transportation corridors, and population. It also prevents the Federation from being excessively dependent upon a narrow coastal strip. The cost is constitutional complexity. If Nevada is admitted, the Constitution should recognize a Great Basin regional system encompassing Nevada and the adjacent Pacific-facing portions of Idaho, Oregon, California, and possibly Montana. This would prevent Nevada from being treated as a political anomaly. IX. The better boundary, Pacifica as a Pacific bioregional federation. The best answer is therefore not to draw Pacifica's border according to existing state lines. Instead, Pacifica should define itself through several overlapping principles. Pacific maritime orientation. Continental geographic continuity. Economic interdependence. Watershed and ecological systems. Strategic defensibility. Democratic consent. Indigenous sovereignty. Administrative viability. Under this model, the original territory is the optimal core. Nevada becomes a voluntary accession state. Western Idaho and western Montana should not necessarily be defined through arbitrary longitudinal lines. Their inclusion should be determined county by county or through negotiated constituent state arrangements based upon economic, ecological, and democratic relationships. This would be more sophisticated than saying, everything west of X longitude belongs to Pacifica. The constitutional structure could therefore establish a Pacifica Union of states and sovereign peoples, while permitting territories, indigenous nations, municipalities, and autonomous bioregions to retain substantial jurisdiction. X. Economic viability. Economically, Pacifica would be extraordinarily viable. The combination of California technology and finance, Pacific Northwest manufacturing and energy, British Columbia resources and ports, Alaska energy and minerals, Baja agriculture and manufacturing potential, Hawaii strategic services, and interior mineral and energy resources creates an unusually diversified economic base. The Pacifica economy would possess at least 8 major pillars. Technology, advanced manufacturing, agriculture, energy, maritime commerce, natural resources, tourism, and scientific aerospace industries. This is important because national resilience comes from diversification. A state dependent upon one commodity is vulnerable. A state possessing semiconductor manufacturing, agriculture, fisheries, software, aerospace, energy, minerals, ports, tourism, biotechnology, and advanced services is much harder to economically cripple. Pacifica's constitutional economic model reinforces this possibility. The Constitution explicitly advocates distributist economics, widespread property ownership, small business, markets, private enterprise, and a baseline of social protection. Its welfare provisions similarly attempt to establish a floor beneath which people should not fall while preserving incentives for work, savings, enterprise, family formation, and property accumulation. That combination could be exceptionally powerful if implemented competently. The danger is that constitutional aspirations could become fiscally contradictory. Universal benefits, infrastructure, defense, environmental protection, public computing infrastructure, healthcare, housing assistance, and other services require enormous revenue. Pacifica therefore cannot abolish fiscal reality. A constitutional state may limit taxation philosophically, but it cannot repeal arithmetic. The Constitution itself recognizes this tension, admitting that its taxation powers are pragmatic and utilitarian rather than perfectly derived from its theory of natural rights. That admission is intellectually useful. A mature Pacifica should retain it and build a transparent fiscal system around it. 11. Maritime power. Pacifica's greatest strategic asset may ultimately be its coastline. The proposed federation would possess an enormous Pacific and Arctic maritime frontage. Under the international law of the sea, a coastal state can exercise sovereign rights over natural resources within its exclusive economic zone, extending generally to 200 nautical miles from its baselines. Continental shelf rights also create important resource opportunities over seabed and subsoil resources. Thus the maritime territory of Pacifica would potentially be vastly larger than its land territory. This matters for fisheries, offshore energy, seabed minerals, scientific research, submarine cables, shipping, and environmental protection. Pacifica should therefore be conceived as a maritime civilization, not merely a continental republic. Its navy, coast guard, merchant marine, ports, shipbuilding industry, fisheries institutions, and oceanographic institutions would be central national institutions. The Pacific economy would also become substantially more resilient if Pacifica possessed several major independent port complexes rather than relying upon one or two. Vancouver, Seattle-Tacoma, Portland, Oakland, Los Angeles-Long Beach, San Diego, Honolulu, and Baja California ports could form a national maritime network. 12. Defense and strategic viability. Pacifica would be extraordinarily defensible in geographic terms but extremely expensive to defend. Its northern and eastern borders would touch powerful neighboring states, the United States, Canada, and Mexico, depending upon the final settlement. Its maritime frontier would expose it to the Pacific. Its enormous length would create logistical difficulties. Yet the geographic advantages are substantial. The Pacific mountain systems provide defensive terrain. Alaska provides strategic depth. The Sierra Nevada and Cascades create natural barriers. The Pacific Ocean provides enormous maneuver space. Hawaii provides central Pacific depth. The principal strategic requirement would be a denial-oriented defense doctrine, not imperial power projection. Pacifica would not need to dominate the Pacific Ocean. It would need to make invasion, blockade, coercion, or strategic strangulation prohibitively expensive. That means a combination of naval and coast guard forces, submarines, air defense, dispersed aviation, resilient electrical grids, hardened communications, strategic reserves, cyber defense, civilian emergency preparedness, distributed manufacturing, transportation redundancy, protected ports, Arctic surveillance, and mutually reinforcing regional defense commands. This approach is particularly compatible with Pacifica's constitutional suspicion of concentrated power. The Constitution already emphasizes civilian control, constitutional restraints, restrictions on government coercion, and extensive accountability of public servants. The defense establishment should therefore be powerful enough to defend Pacifica but institutionally incapable of becoming Pacifica's master. 13. The greatest problem is not geography, it is state formation. There is one fundamental point that must not be obscured by strategic analysis. A geographically viable country is not necessarily a politically achievable country. Pacifica's territory currently belongs to 3 different sovereign states: the United States, Canada, and Mexico. The United States constitutional position is particularly difficult. In Texas v. White, the Supreme Court held that Texas's unilateral attempt to secede was legally null and described the Union as an indissoluble relationship, while recognizing revolution or consent as the relevant extraordinary mechanisms for changing that relationship. Canada presents a somewhat different constitutional pathway. The Supreme Court's Quebec secession reference rejected unilateral secession but held that a clear democratic mandate would create an obligation to negotiate. Canada's Clarity Act subsequently established statutory requirements concerning a clear referendum question and clear majority before negotiations could proceed. Consequently, a realistic Pacifica cannot be founded on the assumption that declaring independence automatically creates sovereignty. The supplied declaration is philosophically built around self-determination and the right of a people to establish a new government. But statehood requires more than a declaration. It requires effective institutions, territory, population, government, international relations capacity, and ultimately sufficient external recognition or practical acceptance. This is where Pacifica's constitutional project should become more sophisticated. The pathway to independence should be conceived as a constitutional transition, not merely a revolutionary proclamation. 14. A viable constitutional transition. The strongest possible Pacifican strategy would therefore proceed through stages. First would come the development of a Pacifican constitutional community. Second would come democratic ratification by participating jurisdictions. Third would come negotiated compacts concerning property, debt, citizenship, military installations, federal assets, water, transportation, currency, pensions, indigenous sovereignty, and international treaties. Fourth would come transitional recognition. Fifth would come full sovereignty. The constitutional document itself should provide a transition framework. It should distinguish between the right of the people to establish Pacifica and the practical legal process by which existing governments transfer sovereign authority to Pacifica. That distinction would dramatically strengthen Pacifica's legitimacy. 15. Should Pacifica be larger? There are arguments for expansion beyond the proposed territory. Eastern Montana, eastern Idaho, northern Utah, Arizona, western Wyoming, and portions of Alberta could theoretically strengthen the continental resource base. But there is a point where expansion begins destroying the strategic concept. Pacifica should not become everything west of the Mississippi. That would transform it into a generic Western continental state rather than a Pacific civilization. Alberta, for example, would add enormous energy and agricultural resources, but it would also pull Pacifica toward the Canadian interior and Great Plains economic system. Arizona would add population and solar energy but would orient the Federation toward the southwest rather than the Pacific Northwest and Pacific Coast. Utah would add population, minerals, transportation, and interior depth but would further dilute the coastal character. Wyoming would add minerals and energy but comparatively little population. These regions could be valuable economic partners without being constitutionally necessary components of Pacifica. Therefore, expansion should stop before Pacifica becomes a continental empire. 16. The optimal configuration. My final determination is consequently a three-tier model. Tier 1. The Pacifica Core. The core should consist of California, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Hawaii, British Columbia, Yukon, Baja California, western Idaho, and western Montana. This is the strongest interpretation of the original concept. It combines population, technology, agriculture, ports, energy, minerals, Arctic access, Pacific access, strategic depth, and ecological diversity. Tier 2. Nevada. Nevada should be a preferred accession candidate, not an indispensable founding component. If its population democratically chooses union and the constitutional settlement accommodates the Great Basin as a distinct region, Nevada should be admitted. Its inclusion would strengthen Pacifica economically and strategically. Tier 3. Associated and future territories. Other Western jurisdictions should be eligible for accession through constitutional compacts. This could include eastern Idaho, eastern Montana, portions of Utah, or other adjacent areas if their populations independently determine that integration serves their interests. This creates a flexible federation rather than an expansionist one. 17. The Pacifica Constitutional Principle. The deepest lesson is that Pacifica should not define sovereignty as control over territory. Its own constitutional philosophy points toward a more sophisticated principle. Territory exists to provide a jurisdiction within which persons can exercise sovereignty. That is why the Constitution repeatedly places individual rights before government authority and treats governmental power as delegated and fiduciary. The territorial structure should therefore reflect the same philosophy. The federal government should not say, Pacifica owns this territory, therefore Pacifica owns the people. Instead, the constitutional relationship should be people right pointing arrow communities right pointing arrow states indigenous nations bioregions right pointing arrow federal union. The union exists because the constituent peoples find advantages in collective action that cannot be achieved individually. That is the constitutional philosophy most consistent with the Pacifica project. Conclusion: Pacifica is viable, if it understands what it is. Pacifica's proposed territory is not geographically absurd. Quite the opposite. It is one of the more strategically coherent hypothetical nation-building projects imaginable on the North American continent. The original configuration possesses extraordinary economic diversity, agricultural capacity, maritime access, energy resources, mineral resources, technological capacity, population, transportation infrastructure, strategic depth, and access to the Arctic and Central Pacific. California supplies scale. Washington and Oregon supply Pacific Northwest integration. British Columbia supplies northern maritime continuity. Yukon connects the northern continental system. Alaska supplies Arctic depth and resources. Hawaii supplies Central Pacific strategic reach. Baja California supplies southern Pacific continuity. Western Idaho and Montana supply interior depth and resource connections. Nevada would add still more depth, minerals, energy, transportation, and population. The difference between the original Pacifica and the Nevada-inclusive Pacifica is therefore not the difference between viable and non-viable. It is the difference between a coastal Pacific Federation and a broader Pacific Western Federation. My preferred configuration is the latter, but only modestly. I would retain the original territory as the constitutional founding conception and make Nevada an accession state rather than an essential founding state. If Nevada joins, Pacifica should explicitly recognize the Great Basin as a distinct constitutional and ecological region. This solves the principal geographic objection without sacrificing Nevada's strategic benefits. More importantly, Pacifica should resist the temptation to continue expanding eastward simply because additional territory appears economically useful. A nation is not necessarily stronger because it possesses more land. A nation is stronger when the territory it possesses forms a coherent system of people, resources, institutions, transportation, defense, ecology, commerce, and political legitimacy. The original Pacifica already satisfies that test unusually well. Its greatest vulnerability would not be lack of resources. It would be excessive governmental complexity, inadequate fiscal discipline, constitutional contradictions, unresolved indigenous sovereignty, and, above all, the enormous political and legal difficulty of peacefully transforming territory presently belonging to 3 existing states into a new sovereign federation. Those problems are serious, but they are institutional rather than geographic. Indeed, the constitutional draft already contains the conceptual ingredients needed to address many of them: individual sovereignty, federalism, bioregional autonomy, indigenous sovereignty, transparency, open source governance, democratic accountability, distributist economics, constitutional supremacy, and an explicit recognition that government exists as an instrument of the people rather than as their master. The ultimate strategic wisdom would therefore be to stop thinking of Pacifica as an enlarged California, an independent Cascadia, or a Western American secession project. Pacifica is potentially something much more distinctive. A Pacific Federation of sovereign persons, constitutional states, indigenous nations, municipalities, and bioregions, organized around the Pacific Ocean and Western North American continental system. Under that conception, the original territorial proposal is viable. The Nevada-inclusive version is arguably stronger. A substantially larger version is unnecessary. And a substantially smaller version risks sacrificing precisely the geographic diversity that would make Pacifica independent rather than merely autonomous. The ideal Pacifica is therefore neither the smallest possible country nor the largest imaginable one. It is the smallest territory capable of sustaining genuine strategic independence while remaining sufficiently decentralized to preserve the individual sovereignty upon which Pacifica's entire constitutional philosophy rests. That is why the strongest territorial formula is California plus Oregon plus Washington plus British Columbia plus Alaska plus Yukon plus Hawaii plus Baja California plus Western Idaho plus Western Montana, with Nevada as a constitutionally available accession state and with future enlargement determined through democratic, indigenous, bioregional, and constitutional consent. Such a Pacifica would possess something rare in hypothetical nation-building, not merely an inspiring ideology, but the geographic foundations of an actual civilization state.